Today we start the new quarterly, and it's the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. And it talks about in the beginning of the study guide, there, Job, not really according to the study guide, positive who wrote it. It's obviously about Job, and we'll talk about him. He gets introduced here in today's lesson. It says some people propose maybe Job himself was the writer, but not really sure. The other book that we'll cover in this quarterly is Ecclesiastes, which was written by Solomon. They're pretty certain about that. And that's going to be, I think, the last four lessons in the quarter. Sure, let's see. But we'll start with Job and go through that. Here we go. Ecclesiastes is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The last 6 lessons. So the first few will be in Job. Y'all familiar? Heard the story of Job? Have you ever heard the expression, the patience of Job? That's as I've heard it, and it's, you kind of assume that it means Job was patient for some reason, and he must have had a lot of patience. And as you read the story as we go through this, not sure exactly how long Job's suffering lasted, but what to me is more important about, rather than the patience of Job, was the faith of Job. And that's kind of what this is going to be about. So as an introduction to him, the verses for today is Job 1, 8 through 22. And let's just kind of look through the first 7 verses just to get an idea of who Job was. So Job is, this book is only about his story. And as we look at the beginning, he's introduced in the first verse. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright and one that feared God and eschewed evil. So first thing is, when we look at the word perfect, it doesn't mean like Jesus perfect without flaw. In this context, it just means that he was a good man. He walked correctly with God. Okay. Let me find it on my phone here too, because it actually has a definition of it. So perfect in this context, it means this says blameless. Okay. So he was a good man. He was upright. So he was a godly man, one that feared God and eschewed evil, which means he turned away, shunned evil. That's what eschewed means. Okay, so that's sort of who he is. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. So these were his kids, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And then the next verse talks about his substance. And what you'll see here, Job was a wealthy man. Okay, he had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. 500 yoke of oxen. A yoke, I don't know if a yoke is 1 or 2 oxen, but he's got a lot of oxen. I can beat the low power. There we go. Okay. So back to Job. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and I guess the significance of having female donkeys is that by having females, you can have more, right? Because they can give birth to others. And it says he had a very great household. So I guess that means kind of his house and his property, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. So in Uz, wherever that was, I'm not exactly sure. But where he lived, it says he was the greatest of all the men there. So he was wealthy. All right. Now, in verse 4, his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So they had apparently a strong family. They hung out with each other. They feasted together, called their siblings to come and fellowship with them, eat, hang out. And so, verse 5, when the days of their feasting were gone about, so about over, that Job sent and sanctified them. Hey, Job sent and sanctified them and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. So this verse is kind of important because we talked about his 7 sons and his 3 daughters and how they would get together and feast, and with Job as well. When the feast was done, see what Job did there in verse 5. He sent and sanctified them and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt sacrifices according to the number of them all. So this would be like a parent praying for their children. Okay, not only taking care of them, but praying for them that God would watch over them, take care of them, and he even went so far as he offered burnt offerings there in the middle of verse 5, according to the number of them all. So he made a sacrifice for each of his kids and said, and just in case, it may be that my sons have sinned, morning, Ella, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their heart. So just in case, now his sons and daughters should be, making an offering for themselves, right? Because that was one of the things, if you sin, you need to make an atonement for that. And in those days, it was an offering. But Job, just in case they didn't or forgot, he would make an offering on their behalf. Okay, so he really loved his children. He loved the Lord. He wanted to take care of them. And he also wanted to do his part as much as he could to atone for their sins. We talked about this in our lesson, I think, on Friday night when we were up on our trip, that in this day and time, I can pray for each one of you, my children, my parents, my wife, as much as I want, but I cannot save you, right? That is something that each of you has to do on your own. In these days, it was the offering that was made to atone for sins. Okay, so that's how it was in those days. Now, there's kind of there's sort of Job sort of paints the picture of him. And in verse 6, it says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God," so here's this up in heaven, in God's kingdom. "Now there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou?" Meaning, where have you been? Where are you coming from? And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it." So Satan says, "I've just been wandering the earth." And it talks about in the study guide, Satan is the prince of the power of the air. God has given him God is ultimately in control of everything, but he has allowed Satan to have power in this earth. So Satan just says, "Yeah, I was just kind of walking around the earth," which means he was looking for a way to make some trouble for somebody. All right. Now, so there's the introduction. I want to read through the introduction from the study guide here, and then we'll get into the verses for the lesson. It says, again, as it's describing Job, the text clearly states that Job was a man of integrity. That's in verse 1. At the outset, the book of Job establishes that none of the tragedies that are to beset him, so there's a little bit of a spoiler alert, Job's about to come on some trouble. None of the tragedies that are about to beset him happen as God's punishment or discipline on account of Job's sin. Now, God has punished and does punish sin, right? And there is judgment. But in this case, Job is a righteous man. He's he was perfect or blameless. Okay, so this is not God punishing him. Everything about Job was sincere as he sought to live according to God's will. In fact, he was not only meticulous about continuing in faithful obedience to God, he was deeply concerned about the spiritual condition of his children, okay, as we talked about. And so what I underlined here was Job's uprightness is essential to the message of the book. If Job was just a greedy, wealthy, greedy, bad guy, then you'd think when Satan asks God what's coming up in the story, God would say, whatever. And now God doesn't say whatever to anybody. God wants that none should perish, that all should repent and come to heaven. But it's important to understand that Job was this upright man. Okay, that's central to this book. All right, now Job 1:6, it says, introduces Satan into the narrative. Satan's name means accuser or adversary. He belittles God. Satan mocks God. And remember, the reason Satan was cast out of heaven was because he tried to elevate himself higher than God. And he got some other angels and said, I'm going to make myself greater than God, which can't happen. So God cast him out of heaven with, I think it was a third of the angels, if I remember a lot, that were kind of with Satan, and God cast them out. So Satan belittles God. Ultimately, God will win. Pastor's talked about that in the last few weeks of Revelation. I mean, God has already won. We're just waiting to see it unfold. But Satan belittles God, demonstrates he is an enemy of those faithful to God by seeking to destroy them. So us, if we're faithful to God, do the best that we can to be as righteous as we can, even though we can't, meet God's standard. But even no matter how hard we try, Satan is going to attack us as an individual, as a group, as a church. That's what Satan does, is constantly trying to tear us down and give us doubts in God. And it says he is the accuser of the people of God. All right. And what's going to happen here is you'll see Satan raises the questions that are at the heart of the book of Job. You'll see it in a minute when Satan asks, is God worthy of worship for who he is, or is he worth worshiping only for what one can get out of him? Is it possible for those who belong to God to remain faithful to him in the midst of great suffering? God allowed Satan to take away Job's wealth, health, and family while sparing God's life, demonstrating that Satan was under God's authority and only a pawn. All right? So there's that coming up. And that's where we're going to go right now. All right. The question that I asked here, is it possible for those who belong to God to remain faithful to him in the midst of great suffering? In the introduction to this book, it talked about the last year and a half now or so. I don't know how your families have been affected, but all across the world, because of this COVID, when they lock people down, when businesses have to close because people couldn't go to work, it hurts the businesses, right? And it hurts the people because they may or may not be getting a paycheck. Some businesses have closed and they'll never be able to open back up, because if I'm a business owner, if I own Panera Bread, I'm the franchisee, right? And so normally when you do that, if you say, I want to open a Chick-fil-A or a Taco Bell or a Panera Bread or whatever it is, you have to pay the corporation to be able to use that name to open that. And then they tell you, okay, here's the building, what it looks like, how you have to do it. And generally speaking, especially if you're just starting something like that, you have to get loans. I mean, it costs a lot of money to open up a restaurant franchise. I mean, any business costs a lot of money. So a lot of times people have to take out loans and all of that, right? And you count on, and maybe you're leasing the building,